Story 1. The Whispering Wallpaper. It started with a faint whisper in the dead of night, coming from behind the floral wallpaper in the bedroom. At first, I thought it was the wind. Now I know better. I had just bought the house, my first real home, a charming little fixer-upper on the edge of town. It was perfect for me. Old enough to have character, small enough to manage alone, and cheap enough for my modest budget. Sure, the wallpaper was hideous, and the floorboards groaned with every step, but I figured those were problems I could fix with some elbow grease. I had no idea what I was getting into. The first night, I barely noticed the whispering. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe my overactive imagination. The second night, it was louder, a soft, hissing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over my head and telling myself it was nothing. By the third night, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was voices. They were faint, like someone murmuring just out of earshot, but I couldn't make out the words. I pressed my ear to the wall, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard my name. That's when I decided to investigate. The wallpaper in the bedroom was old and peeling at the edges, its faded floral pattern curling away from the plaster, like it was trying to escape. I grabbed a putty knife and started to scrape, hoping to find some kind of explanation, a loose board, a vent, anything that could explain the sound. Instead, I found something much worse. Beneath the wallpaper, scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting, were words. "Help me." My stomach turned. The words were written over and over again, layered beneath the wallpaper like a secret message no one was supposed to find. I kept scraping, and more words appeared. "Don't trust the walls." The whispers grew louder as I worked, as if the act of peeling the wallpaper was waking something up. I almost stopped. Almost. But I couldn't. There was a compulsion now, a need to keep going, to uncover the truth. I peeled away another section and found a small hollow in the wall, barely big enough to fit my hand. Inside was a photograph. It was yellowed with age, the edges curling like the wallpaper it had been hidden behind. It showed a family, 2 parents and 3 children, standing stiffly in front of what looked like this very house. At first, it seemed like a normal, albeit dated, family portrait. But then I noticed the youngest child. She was staring directly at the camera. No, not at the camera, at me. Her wide, glassy eyes bore into mine, her face frozen in an expression that was equal parts fear and accusation. I dropped the photo like it burned me. That night, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they became a cacophony. And then came the scratching. It started as a faint scrape, like a mouse scurrying in the walls. But it wasn't a mouse. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Fingernails clawing at the plaster. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Whispers and scratching, over and over until I thought I would lose my mind. At one point, I swear I felt something brush against my leg under the covers. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a hammer, I started breaking through the plaster, desperate to find the source of the noise. Dust filled the air, the dry, acrid taste clogging my throat as I tore through the wall. That's when I found the bones. They were small, misshapen, piled haphazardly in the hollow space behind the wall. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My brain refused to make the connection, but then I saw the skulls. Tiny skulls. I stumbled back, while rising in my throat, as the realization hit me. These weren't animal bones. I called the police. They arrived within the hour, cordoning off the area and treating it as a crime scene. I told them everything, the whispers, the scratches, the messages on the wall. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Not about the whispers anyway. They sealed off the bedroom and told me to stay elsewhere while they investigated. I packed a bag and left, thinking it was over. I was wrong. That night, in the guest room, the whispers returned. This time, they were different, louder, closer, and they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the ceiling. Terrified, I grabbed the photograph I had taken from the wall earlier, needing some kind of explanation, some kind of connection. As I stared at it, my heart stopped. The youngest child was gone. She was no longer in the picture. The space where she had been standing was empty, but her absence wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the faint reflection in the glass of the frame. Behind me, in the doorway, I saw her. I didn't hear her move. I didn't feel her approach. But as I lay in bed that night, frozen in terror, I felt the tiny, icy hands pulling at me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. And then, just before everything went black, I heard her whisper, clear as day, "You shouldn't have peeled it back." Story 2. The room that shouldn't exist. When the movers accidentally knocked a hole in the wall, they revealed something I wasn't ready to see. A hidden door to a room that wasn't on the blueprints. A room that was wrong. My partner, Aaron, and I had just moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place we'd always dreamed of. Big bay windows, original wood floors, a wraparound porch. It had charm, as the realtor had put it, though charm, we quickly learned, also meant a leaky roof, ancient wiring, and enough creaks and groans at night to make it sound haunted. We were in the middle of unpacking when it happened. One of the movers, a young guy with a patchy beard, slipped while carrying a box of books. The corner of the box slammed into the wall at the end of the upstairs hallway, punching through the plaster like it was paper. "Damn it," he muttered, looking embarrassed. "It's fine," I said, more annoyed about the dent than the hole itself. But as I bent down to inspect it, I noticed something odd. Behind the plaster wasn't wood or insulation, like I expected. It was another door. Aaron came over, peering over my shoulder. "That's weird," she said, frowning. We hadn't seen it during the inspection. The floor plan didn't show any extra rooms either. Aaron grabbed a flashlight and pried the edges of the hole wider until we could see the whole thing. The door was old, painted white, with a tarnished brass knob. "Do you think we should open it?" she asked. "Why not?" I replied, though in hindsight, I wish I'd said no. The door opened easily, the hinges creaking like they hadn't moved in decades. Behind it was a room, a nursery. The air inside was stale, heavy, and it smelled faintly of something sweet, like old flowers. The room was perfectly preserved, as if time had forgotten it. There was a crib in one corner, a mobile of faded paper stars dangling from the ceiling above it. A small bookshelf held a row of children's books, their spines cracked with age. But it was the rocking horse in the center of the room that drew my attention. It was carved from dark wood, its paint faded and peeling. It was facing us, its hollow eyes staring at the doorway like it had been waiting for someone to open it. "Creepy," Aaron said with a nervous laugh. "This feels like something out of a horror movie." I nodded, but something about the room unsettled me. It felt wrong. We didn't stay long. After a quick look around, Aaron closed the door and we decided to deal with it later. We went back to unpacking, but that night I couldn't stop thinking about the nursery. I should have stayed away. The first strange thing happened the next morning. Erin was in the kitchen, making coffee, when she asked, "Did you move my phone?" I shook my head. "No." "Why?" She frowned. "It was on the counter last night, and now it's gone. I just found it in the bathroom." We shrugged it off as forgetfulness. Moving is stressful, and things get misplaced all the time. But then more things started disappearing. Keys, a coffee mug, one of my shirts. We'd find them later in random places, like they'd been moved by someone or something. And then there were the noises. At night, I heard faint sounds coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was mice scratching, scurrying, but then it became more distinct. A faint creaking, like floorboards groaning under the weight of something heavy. It was Erin who noticed the rocking horse first. She'd gone back to the nursery out of curiosity, only to find that it had moved. "It's facing the window now," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't believe her at first, but when I went to see for myself, she was right. Neither of us had touched it. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the old wood. Then faintly I heard it crying, a baby crying. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Erin stirred beside me, muttering something about a bad dream, but I didn't wake her. I didn't want her to hear it too. The crying stopped, and for a moment everything was still. And then, clear as day, I heard something else, the soft creak of the rocking horse moving. The next morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I started digging through the house's history, searching for any clue about the nursery. Eventually, I found an old newspaper clipping from the 1940s. A little boy had disappeared from the house. His name was Samuel, and he was only 3 years old. No trace of him was ever found. I showed Erin the article, but she didn't want to hear it. "You're just scaring yourself," she said. "It's an old house. Old houses are weird." But I could see the fear in her eyes. That night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. "Erin," I called, my voice echoing through the house. No answer. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, even the porch. She was nowhere to be found. Finally, I thought of the nursery. The door was open, and the faint scent of old flowers drifted out into the hallway. I stepped inside, my hands shaking. Erin was there, sitting on the rocking horse, her back to me. She was rocking slowly, back and forth, humming a soft, tuneless melody. "Erin," I whispered, stepping closer. She didn't respond. When I walked around to face her, my stomach dropped. Her eyes were wide and glassy, staring at nothing. Her lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear. I leaned in, and her voice, soft and high-pitched like a child, said, "They've been waiting for you." Before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me. The last thing I saw was the rocking horse, swaying gently as the room plunged into darkness. No one ever found us. No one ever will. Story 3. The Thing in the Crawl Space. I knew the house was old, but I wasn't expecting to find a trapdoor in the wall behind the kitchen cabinets. And I definitely wasn't expecting to hear something moving down there. It started as an ordinary renovation project. The house was a fixer-upper with decades of bad decisions layered on top of one another like geological strata. Mismatched wallpaper, peeling linoleum floors, cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 70s. My plan was to start with the kitchen, new cabinets, new counters, the works. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine. While pulling out one of the cabinets, I noticed a section of the wall behind it that looked wrong. The wallpaper didn't match the rest of the kitchen, and when I tapped on it, the sound was hollow. That's when I saw the edges of what looked like a door, hidden under layers of plaster and paint. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a utility knife and started cutting through the wallpaper, peeling it back to reveal a small wooden trapdoor. It had no handle, just a metal latch that was so rusted I had to pry it open with a screwdriver. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't just leave it. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaky stairs into what I assumed was some kind of crawl space. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the smell of dirt and mildew. The walls were rough stone, and they weren't just stone, they were carved. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but as I ran my flashlight over the walls, I realized the carvings were far older than the house itself. They were symbols scratched deep into the stone, almost like hieroglyphs. Some looked human, a handprint, maybe a face, but others were distorted, animalistic. One of them looked like a spider, but with far too many legs. In the far corner of the crawl space, something caught my eye. A wooden box, covered in a thick layer of dust, sat half buried in the dirt. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and locked with a rusted clasp. I should have left it alone. Instead, I took it upstairs and forced the clasp open with a screwdriver. Inside were brittle, leather-like scraps of paper covered in symbols that matched the carvings on the walls. They were written in a language I didn't recognize, and the texture of the paper made me shudder. It felt wrong, almost like skin. But the worst thing in the box was the doll. It was small and disfigured, its face crudely stitched together with black thread. One of its button eyes was missing, and it smelled faintly of something rotten, like meat left out in the sun. I don't know why, but just holding it made my hands tremble. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the crawl space, about the carvings, about the doll. Around 2 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a soft shuffling noise coming from inside the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon in the attic. But then the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't random, like an animal scurrying. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy, like something dragging itself through the walls. The next morning, I told myself it was my imagination. I patched up the trapdoor, sealing it with heavy nails and a layer of wood, and tried to put it out of my mind. But the noises didn't stop. Every night, they grew louder, closer. Scratching, shuffling, sometimes a faint tapping like something was testing the walls, searching for a way out. I bought cameras, cheap, motion-activated ones, and set them up around the house. I wanted proof, or at least some idea of what I was dealing with. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, I finally caught something. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my blood ran cold. There was a figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way, and its face was a pale blur like the camera couldn't quite focus on it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. And then, in an instant, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room with every light in the house on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would make any difference. The noises in the walls were constant now, relentless, as if whatever was in there was angry. The next day, I tried to seal the trapdoor again, this time with concrete. I poured it over the wood, layering it thick, and prayed it would be enough. For a moment, the house was silent. That night, it broke through. I was lying in bed when the wall next to me exploded in a shower of plaster and wood. The thing, whatever it was, burst into the room, all jagged teeth and glowing eyes. Its limbs twisted unnaturally as it crawled toward me, its breath reeking of decay. I ran. I didn't even think about it. I just bolted, slamming the bathroom door behind me and locking it. The thing pounded on the door, its claws splintering the wood, but somehow it stopped. After what felt like hours, the house went quiet. When I finally opened the door, the thing was gone. I thought it was over. I thought I'd survived. But when I went to the bathroom mirror to wash the blood and dust off my face, I froze. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the thing wearing my face like a mask. It grinned, and then it whispered, "I'm still here." Story 4. The Faces in the Brick. When I started scraping the old paint off the basement walls, I didn't think I'd find faces staring back at me. Dozens of faces carved into the brick. The house was over 100 years old. One of those picturesque Victorians that looks perfect in real estate listings but hides a million little problems the moment you move in. I bought it because of the basement. It wasn't finished, but it had potential. High ceilings, big enough to turn into a home office or maybe a den. The walls were covered in thick, peeling paint. The floor was cracked concrete, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, flickering shadows. It wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. I decided to clean it up one weekend. The first step was dealing with the walls. The paint was uneven, and some parts had bubbled and flaked off entirely, leaving patches of brick underneath. I grabbed a scraper and started peeling it away. That's when I found the first face. It was small, about the size of my hand, and carved into the brick like some kind of relief sculpture. The features were crude, but unmistakably human. 2 hollow eyes, a flat nose, and a slightly open mouth. It wasn't screaming, but it wasn't smiling either. It looked like it was in pain. I stopped scraping and stared at it for a while. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of decorative feature, like the gargoyles you see on old churches. Maybe the original builder of the house had been eccentric. It was weird, sure, but not alarming. At least, not yet. I kept scraping. As more paint came off, I found another face, then another, and another. Soon, the entire wall was covered with them. Dozens of human faces, all carved into the brick. Some were calm, their expressions serene or blank, but others were twisted in terror. Mouths stretched open in silent screams, eyes wide with fear. The detail in some of them was horrifying. Individual teeth, deep lines etched into their faces, tears carved into the brick as if the stone itself had cried. I should have stopped then. I should have left the basement, called someone, anyone, and had them deal with it. But I didn't. Something about the faces fascinated me. I couldn't stop looking at them. Couldn't stop running my fingers over the rough stone. That night, I had the first nightmare. I was in the basement, standing in front of the wall of faces. They were moving now, their mouths opening and closing as they whispered, though I couldn't make out the words. Then the bricks began to shift, pulling apart like a door opening. Beyond the wall was darkness, and in that darkness, I could see hands. Dozens of them, pale, clawing hands, reaching for me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I told myself it was just my imagination. Spending hours alone in a creepy basement would mess with anyone's head. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I went down there, the faces seemed different. There were more of them, I was sure of it. Faces that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But when I went back and compared photos I'd taken on my phone, I knew I wasn't. New faces had appeared in the walls, and they were even more detailed than the others. One of them looked so real, I could almost swear it was breathing. I started researching the house, desperate for answers. It had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Granger, a mason who had lived here until he disappeared in 1912. There were no records of him after that, no obituary, no grave, nothing. People in town said he was a recluse, that he worked alone and didn't trust anyone. Some even claimed he was cursed, though I figured that was just small-town gossip. The nightmares got worse. In one, I was trapped in the wall. My body was pressed into the cold, unyielding stone, unable to move, unable to scream. I could see people walking by, strangers, sometimes people I knew, but they couldn't see me. They couldn't hear me, even as I screamed for help. And then there were the voices. I started hearing them in the basement. Not just in my dreams, but when I was awake. At first, it was faint, like a breeze moving through a crack in the wall. But then they grew louder, whispering words I couldn't understand. And the faces, they kept multiplying. One morning, I went down to the basement and found a new face on the wall. It was mine. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The face was identical. Every line, every curve, every scar. It even had the small mole above my left eyebrow. I ran upstairs and locked the basement door. I didn't go back down for days, but the voices followed me. I could hear them in the walls now, whispering to me as I tried to sleep. That's when I noticed my reflection was wrong. At first, it was subtle. My face in the bathroom mirror seemed off. The expression wasn't quite right, like it wasn't following me exactly. When I smiled, it didn't smile back. When I touched my face, the reflection hesitated before copying me. The last time I looked in the mirror, my reflection didn't move at all. I ran out of the bathroom, my heart hammering in my chest, and made my way to the basement. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could stop it, that I could fix whatever was happening to me. When I got to the basement, the wall was alive. The faces moved, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. My own face was there, staring back at me, its eyes wide with terror. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then I felt it. The wall was pulling me in. The cold, rough stone pressed against my skin, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own face, frozen in the wall, its mouth stretched open in a silent scream. When someone finally buys this house, they'll start scraping the walls. And when they do, they'll find me. They'll find all of us. Story 5. The house that keeps changing. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I noticed it. The hallway was longer than it had been an hour ago. And the door at the end? It wasn't there before. The house had been left to me by an uncle I barely remembered. A man who, according to my mother, had been a little strange. I hadn't seen him since I was a kid, and when I got the call that I'd inherited his property, I couldn't even picture his face. Still, a free house was a free house, and with rent prices skyrocketing, I didn't hesitate to pack up my life and move in. It was a massive Victorian in the middle of nowhere. The kind of house people take one look at and whisper about, too big for one person, with gabled roofs and a porch that wrapped all the way around. Inside, the floors were scratched and dusty, the air thick with the smell of age. It wasn't perfect, but I could make it work. The first few days were normal, if a little lonely. I spent most of my time unpacking, rearranging furniture, and trying to figure out how to keep the creaky old heater from rattling at night. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to being in the middle of the woods. No neighbors, no cars, just me and the sound of the wind in the trees. Then the house started changing. It was subtle at first. I'd go to bed, and when I woke up, the furniture in the living room would be slightly out of place. A chair turned just a few inches, a table moved closer to the wall. I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I'd done it myself and forgotten. But then I noticed the hallway. It was off the living room, a short stretch leading to a bathroom and a small storage closet. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. That day, as I carried an armful of books toward the shelves I'd just set up, I stopped in my tracks. The hallway was longer. I stood there, staring. The bathroom door was still there, but it looked farther away, like the hallway had stretched itself out. At the end of it, where the storage closet should have been, there was now a second door. My stomach twisted. I don't remember walking down the hallway, but suddenly I was there, my hand on the knob. The door was old, its wood cracked and weathered, and the brass knob felt ice cold under my fingers. When I opened it, I found a small, windowless room. It was empty, except for a single object in the center, a tall, oval mirror with an ornate brass frame. I stepped inside, drawn to the mirror despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck. It wasn't dusty like the rest of the house. Its surface was clean and polished, almost unnaturally so. I could see my reflection perfectly, and then I saw something else. Behind me, just out of focus, was a shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I turned to look, the shadow didn't move. It stayed in the mirror, standing there, watching me. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. The next morning, the hallway was back to normal. The extra door was gone, and the storage closet was where it had always been. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, maybe, or the weirdness of living alone in a huge, unfamiliar house. But then the mirror started following me. Every mirror in the house showed the shadow now. At first, it was faint, barely visible. But each time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, the figure was closer. In the bathroom mirror, I saw it standing behind me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. In the glass of the bedroom vanity, its hand was raised, as if reaching for me. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. Then the kitchen rearranged itself. I walked in one night to grab a snack and froze. The table was gone. The refrigerator was on the opposite wall. The sink, which had always been under the window, was now in the center of the room. Even the cabinets were different, their doors swapped with ones I'd never seen before. I stumbled back, my skin crawling. I needed to get out of the house. Grabbing my phone, I rushed to the front door and stepped outside, shivering in the cold night air. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. I dialed my mother's number, hoping she'd pick up, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Frustrated, I turned back toward the house, only to find it was gone. The front yard stretched out into the woods like the house had never been there. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. The house was massive. Where could it have gone? I turned in circles, panic clawing at my chest. And then I saw it. The house was deeper in the woods, its dark silhouette barely visible between the trees. I don't know why I walked toward it. I don't remember making the decision to go back. One moment I was outside, and the next I was standing in the entryway, the door slamming shut behind me. But it wasn't the same house. The walls were wrong, twisting at impossible angles. The hallways stretched on forever, splitting and turning back on themselves like a maze. Rooms that should have been side by side were now separated by staircases, their doors opening into endless voids. I ran, but the house didn't let me go. I don't know how long I wandered through those endless hallways, but eventually, I found my bedroom. The bed was there, the nightstand, even the book I'd been reading before all of this started. It looked normal, safe. I walked to the window, hoping to see something, anything that made sense. And I did. Outside, standing on the lawn, was me. I was staring up at the window, my face pale and blank, my eyes unblinking. A cold hand touched my shoulder. I turned, but I already knew what I would see. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.